Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Sandman Volume 3, Dream Country, by Neil Gaiman. Now, this is Volume 3 of Neil Gaiman's Sandman series, which is a comic book series published between the years 1989 and 1996. Or at least I think that's when the original run of the series was going. The series was revived in, I think, 2009, and the series has also had multiple spin-offs made to it. Now, I have done reviews on the first two volumes of this series, and I'll leave links to those videos in the description below. Now, the series was published by Vertigo, which is an imprint of DC Comics. And the series incorporates elements of all these different genres, like horror, dark fantasy, black comedy, satire, drama, and there are also elements of the superhero genre in the series as well, because this is actually set in the DC universe, or at least it's set in a universe where characters like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and the rest of the Justice League exist, because I did hear that the stuff that's published under Vertigo is supposed to be set in a slightly different continuity than the mainstream DC continuity, but regardless, it's set in a universe where familiar DC characters do exist. For example, Martian Manhunter shows up in the first Sandman story arc, Preludes and Nocturnes. So does Jonathan Crane, or the Scarecrow, who is primarily a Batman villain. Also, the character of John Dee, or Dr. Destiny, who is primarily an antagonist of the Justice League. He was the main villain of Volume 1 of this series. Also, the character of John Constantine from the Swamp Thing and Hellblazer comics, he also shows up in the first Sandman story arc. Also, prior to these comics, there were other DC characters known as the Sandman, and Neil Gaiman actually does incorporate the other DC Sandmen into this story as well, especially in the second volume of this series, The Doll's House, where you saw Jack Kirby's version of the Sandman, and the parts of that book dealing with Jack Kirby's Sandman are actually really fucked up. Now, this whole series sort of deals with the concept that what if when we dream we're actually going into another dimension, and the series follows a character named Morpheus who is the king of this other dimension. Now, Morpheus is based on a figure from Greek mythology. Now, in this series you find out that Morpheus is actually part of a group of celestial beings called the Endless, who are older than time and space, and are even older than God himself. Now, Dream Country kind of stands apart from the other volumes of this series, because this is really a collection of 4 standalone stories that just happen to take place in the Sandman universe, and in one of these stories, Morpheus doesn't even appear. So, it really doesn't matter which order you read these stories in, but in this video, I'm going to be reviewing each individual story. The first story in here is called Calliope, and this one is about an author who wrote one really successful book, but ever since then he's had no other ideas, so he makes a deal with an older author who is keeping this girl naked in his house and is holding her against her will. But here's the thing about this girl, he kidnapped her in 1927, but the story takes place in the late 80s, which is when these comics were published, and this girl hasn't aged a day since he kidnapped her. It turns out that this girl is actually a muse, like from Greek mythology. So he buys the muse off the older writer, and afterwards he becomes an extremely successful author, screenwriter, and playwright. But the issue is, he's also holding this poor girl against her will, and is also raping her. But he does get his comeuppance at the end when Morpheus shows up. Now, this is easily the most fucked up of all the stories because it's dealing with things like rape, and even though the character of Calliope, even though she's a supernatural being, you still feel just as bad for her as if she were a human character, and that's something that Neil Gaiman does really well, is he takes these mythical creatures but gives them very authentic human emotions. Another thing that's interesting about this story is this story kind of subverts a trope that Stephen King has become really well known for, this trope of sort of making a writer the lead protagonist. This sort of subverts the trope because the two writers that you're introduced to in this story are complete scumbags. And that's the thing I've noticed about a lot of writers when they're writing about writers, is writers are also some of the most self-deprecating people I've ever come across. Like, sometimes a writer is portrayed in a very heroic light, and sometimes writers are portrayed as being liars, which is technically what they are. They're professional liars. One thing I thought was kind of cool is there are two Clive Barker references in this story. At one point, the main character is on a talk show, and he's compared to Clive Barker, and at another point during a party, you see a girl wearing a shirt with Pinhead on it. I thought that was kind of cool because I'm a big Clive Barker fan, and I know Neil Gaiman and Clive Barker are friends, or at least they were back when these comics were published. But yeah, this is a really good story, not even just as a Sandman story, but it's a really good story in general, but be warned, it is kind of fucked up given its subject matter. The next story is A Dream of 1,000 Cats, and basically in the story there's this giant meeting among all these cats, and the cat who called this meeting is telling them a story about how her previous owners, like, she had a litter of kittens, and her previous owners killed her kittens, and she went into the dream world and basically met a cat version of Morpheus, and Morpheus showed her an alternate reality where cats were the rulers of the earth and humans were the prey. But then one human rose up and told the other humans that they must dream of a world where humans are the rulers, and basically it reshaped reality into the reality we now have. This is a really interesting story because it's sort of given this idea that dreams shape our reality. Now, a lot of it is sort of ambiguous. Like, I'm not sure if, like, this story is basically saying, like, okay, this universe actually used to be like that until the humans dreamt of a new world, but it's a very interesting story, and I definitely recommend it if you get this book. The next story in here is A Midsummer Night's Dream, which is based on the William Shakespeare play of the same name. Shakespeare was introduced as a character in a flashback in the second Sandman story arc, The Doll's House. In The Doll's House, it was basically implied that in this universe, Morpheus is the reason Shakespeare turned out to be as good of a playwright as he was. Basically, this story is set in the 16th century, and it follows William Shakespeare himself and his troupe of actors, and they're putting on a production of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which, in this universe, you find out that Morpheus was the one who gave Shakespeare the idea for this play. So, Shakespeare has put it on this play for Morpheus, and Morpheus invites all these fairies, trolls, and hobgoblins into our world to see the play. This is a really interesting story, and it's kind of funny, like, seeing some of the human actors in the play get a little freaked out by the fact that they're performing for supernatural creatures, and they still have to stay in character. It's also funny seeing some of these supernatural creatures react to the fact that some of the characters in the play are based on them. Now, I'll admit, I never read or saw a production of the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, so had I actually read or saw that play, I might appreciate this story a little bit more, but as it is, this was a really entertaining story. And Morpheus says something in this story that I actually thought was really profound. At a certain point, one of his guests is like, well, it was entertaining, but it wasn't true. And Morpheus says, oh, but it is true. Things need not have happened to be true. Tales and dreams are the shadow truths. They will endure when mere facts are dust and ashes and forgot. I thought that was a really profound statement about the nature of stories and also kind of the nature of history. When you think about it, a lot of our history, especially history from hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we have no way of knowing how exactly some of that stuff happened. A lot of it really is stories. Like, how do we know how much of it is really true and how much of it is fictional? The final story in here is called Facade, which is probably the most heartbreaking of the 4 stories, and it's also the one story in this book that has the most direct ties with the DC universe, because the main character of this story is Urania Blackwell, or the Element Girl, who is basically the female version of the superhero Metamorpho. Now, I'll admit, I'm not that familiar with either of these characters. I'm familiar with Metamorpho only because he appeared in an episode of the animated Justice League series, but the plot of this story is it follows Blackwell, who is now retired from being a superhero, and she's pretty much living as a shut-in, and she's pretty much outcast from society because she's not even a human being anymore, and she can't die, but she wants to die, and the whole story is really about her begging for death, and death literally comes for her, as in Morpheus's sister Death, who is one of the Endless. This was a very sad story. I mean, it's sad, but it does end kind of happily, because Blackwell does get what she wants in the end. She does die, but it's sad that death was her only way out. But yeah, it's a very good story, and in a lot of ways, you could kind of compare it to stuff like Alan Moore's Watchmen or Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, because it's a superhero story that really does sort of turn the superhero genre on its ear and portrays superheroes a lot more realistically. Because if superheroes did exist, a lot of them would lead very lonely existences, and a lot of them probably would be suicidal. So that was my review on Dream Country by Neil Gaiman, and bye.